thank you very much for inviting me. And global warming, is it your fault? Is there a climate emergency? Or global warming or cooling? Is it mostly Mother Nature? So we've set ourselves up with rather a polarizing framing in the invitation to this event. And perhaps that was intentional, because that's what we're trying to do, is to reduce that. But I think that we need to talk about the polarizing definitions of climate change, the uncertainties of the greenhouse gas theory of climate change. I want to present some scientific arguments challenging the reliance on climate models, which are computer simulations, and versus the observations. And I want to also explore some undue influences, like the misuse of RCP 8.5 scenario as the business as usual case, big green philanthropies funding e-NGOs for carbon market interests, climate officials misleading the public on the Paris Agreement outcomes, the network for greening the financial system, central banks using a flawed, now retracted study, and covering climate now, media advocacy and fear-mongering, and the risk of implementation of a personal carbon ration to limit your freedoms. So we also are paying staggering costs of $476 billion for Canadian climate action for a potential benefit of 0.007 degrees Celsius reduction in warming by 2100. Which is not very much. That's 7/1000ths of a degree. So I think that we have not just compliers or deniers among us. We have people who are not concerned about climate. We have those who are very concerned about pollution, more than climate change. People concerned about human impacts on climate. Those who are concerned about climate and pollution, but they want to see a cost-benefit analysis. There are some who are quite worried about climate, but they're confused, like how come Al Gore is flying so much if there's a climate crisis? Some people are very angry that people think the economy matters over climate and the future of the planet. Like, what about my kids? And some people literally are terrified. And I have a great deal of empathy for them because, you know, they've been scared to death, literally. So they may be changing their lifestyle, like going vegan or not flying or walking, biking to work. So why is it polarized? Well, I go back to the two different scientific definitions that are out there. One is political, from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was set up very early on, 1992. And their objective was the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And then there's the scientific definition from the IPCC, which is quite neutral. It simply says that climate change, and I can't read this very fine print, climate change refers to a change in the state of the climate that can be identified using statistical tests by changes in the mean or variability of its properties, and that persists for an extended period. Now, they also include here natural influences and anthropogenic, whereas the UNFCCC focuses on anthropogenic. So Dr. Judith Curry is a climate scientist, and she believes that the UNFCCC put the CO2 policy cart before the horse. And she says that we didn't even have any inkling of human influence until 1995, but they made that definition in 1992. And that's her book there that I just showed you. There's also a shorter version online that you can see. And in 2014, she testified to the US Senate Committee on the Environment that, based on the most recent IPCC report at the time, carbon dioxide is not the main driver of climate change. It's not a control knob. Now, this is Dr. Madhav Kandekar. He's been our scientific advisor pretty much since we began. I interviewed him in 2018, and he said that there are more uncertainties in the GHG theory than in his original report that he did for the Alberta government in 2000. So people who argue for a climate emergency often claim these reasons and evidence: that there's a 97% consensus of scientists who agree, there's a correlation of rising temperatures and carbon dioxide concentration, there are more extreme weather events, there is rising insurance costs, loss of biodiversity, future costs of climate change, and fear of an unlivable Earth, no planet B. But actually, there is no consensus. Science is not a democracy. Science is about evidence. That's what Dr. Nir Shaviv said. And actually, when you look at the data, if you look at this report of ours, you'll find that the data where Al Gore, for instance, said no scientists had an opposing view on AGW. In fact, only 13 explicitly agreed in that survey, and all the rest just mentioned climate change. So climate change is cyclical. This graph is similar to the stripes you may have seen out there, but this shows, Dr. Roy Spencer did this, but this shows how there's warming and cooling. It's cyclical, it's not predictable, but there's obviously something going on, because this is 2,000 years of warming and cooling when we had nothing to do with it. And here's a graph that our president put together, who's here tonight, Ron Davison, and you can find out more information on his website. This shows a number of different data sets. You can see the blue line is flat, that's CO2. But in the background, you can see all these temperature data sets showing rising and falling, warming and cooling, and that was long before humans were involved. So climate change is very complex. It's driven by many factors, not just human-caused CO2 emissions. And this is a visualization done by Henri Masson. He's a complex systems expert in Belgium and Switzerland. And you can see, I put a little green box there to show our main contribution, but you can see how very complex this is. And in fact, in the IPCC report of 2001, they actually said in climate research and modeling, we should recognize we're dealing with a coupled, non-linear, chaotic system. That's what we just saw. And therefore, long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. So having said that, they went on to predict future climate states. So this is a graph that our research director put together for me before this event. And you can see the red line represents the climate models, the simulations. The dark blue line represents the University of Alabama Huntsville data sets, which are from satellites. And the pale blue line represents a corrected version of that, dealing with the urban heat island effect. So the IPCC projects 3 degrees of warming per doubling of CO2 with a high climate damage, social cost of carbon. And this projected warming is claimed to be dangerous. But you can see that the model trend is 173% of the measurements. So it's really far off. So if the theory, the climate model, disagrees with the measurement, then it's wrong. So there's a 173% discrepancy between the climate model trend and the measurement. Now, just to give you an idea of the urban heat island effect, this is from London, England. And you can see in the center of London, England, on a typical day in May, it would be 11 degrees Celsius. On the outskirts, in the country, 5 degrees Celsius. That's a 6-degree difference. So this is contaminating all the data sets around the world, because many temperature monitors are now within urban centers or close enough to the urban center that they get the heat retained from the city, you know, all the activity of the people in the city. And also, sadly, some of the data is made up from ghost stations. This is from John Shuchuk. He goes all over the States, and he finds stations that are still being reported when there's no temperature monitor there. He calls them ghost stations. So they're just making up the data for a station that's not operating. And Canadian climate models are perhaps the most wishful thinking of all. It's cold here, but The Canadian climate models are 3.6 times that of the observations. So no wonder we're afraid of global warming here, but the actual observed temperatures don't show that. And this is from the US DOE report. This is Roy Spencer's graph of modeled measured warming trends in the US Corn Belt in 12 states. Shows a huge discrepancy. The observed temperature is the little blue bar. None of these match it. And there are many benefits of carbon dioxide which we don't talk about. CO2 fertilization makes plants grow, and warming benefits are huge in Canada because, you know, for instance, in winter, 1 or 2 degree warmer winter means heating costs are down significantly, especially for industry. And there's also social benefit of carbon in terms of more abundant crops. So Ken Gregory did this analysis of the social benefit of carbon, and rather than a social cost, such as the carbon price going up and up $170 per ton, when he does the analysis based on the fund economic model, he finds that the benefit is about negative 13.7 US dollars per ton CO2 at a 3% discount rate, or negative 7.28 per ton at a 5%. So that means it's a benefit to the society and the economy. So also climate change doesn't drive wildfires. This is a report by Roger Pielke Jr., who's worked for 25 years with the insurance company. He's a climate policy analyst, and he reports that the IPCC has not detected or attributed fire occurrences or area burned to human-caused climate change. And this is a table from the IPCC report, and it was put together like this by Dr. Matt Wilecki. But he shows that there's really no effect of more extreme weather. Also, there's a group called Clintel out of the Netherlands, and there's about 2,000 signatories, scholars and scientists, and they've come up with the World Climate Declaration. Now, these scientists and scholars don't all agree on every aspect of climate. They have vigorous discussions between them, but they do agree on these points. Natural as well as anthropogenic factors cause warming. Warming is slower than predicted. Climate policy relies on inadequate models, as I just showed you. CO2 is the plant food. It's the basis of all life on Earth. And global warming has not increased natural disasters. And also that climate policy must respect scientific and economic realities. So how did we go from climate concerns to a climate emergency? Well, undue influence. These green billionaires put together a report in 2014, just after Dr. Curry's presentation to the Senate. It's called Risky Business, and they incorporated this scenario called RCP 8.5 and called it the business as usual scenario when it was not. And these very big green philanthropies started throwing millions of dollars at environmental non-governmental groups to get them to advocate for the things they wanted, like renewables, like EVs, like phasing out fossil fuels. And they're following a model of Enron. Enron made millions of dollars on cap and trade in the 1990s before their company blew up in a pile of ashes, thanks to off-books accounting. But they saw that carbon dioxide could be a huge market. They went to Kyoto and they were trying to implement the biggest money plays, the rules governing emissions trading, rules governing transfers of emissions reductions rights between countries, and the rules governing a kind of gargantuan clean energy fund. And Enron had also funded environmental groups to make the case for their policies with great success. So if you want to know more about RCP 8.5 and it not being the business as usual case, you can read this report that Robert Lyman did for us. It's fairly plain language. But Canada's Climate Atlas uses it. They claim that it's the business as usual case. Environment Canada uses it. Infrastructure Canada requires cities to use it. And that has implications for taxpayers because they're imagining the most extreme scenario. So if you're building a bridge or a road or whatever, then you have to build it to these maximum potential risks that are not realistic. So here's an example. This is the Climate Atlas, and here they are saying that a high carbon RCP 8.5 is the business as usual case, and is not. And now climate officials are also misleading the public about RCP 8.5 because they're claiming that the Paris Agreement led to the drop in emissions when it did not. They simply stopped using RCP 8.5. And you can see when you take it off the chart, there's no climate emergency. And by the way, after Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, emissions have gone up 12%. And also, sadly, the Network for Greening the Financial System Banks, NGFS as they call themselves, were using a skewed climate damage report that I think it claimed that climate damages would be something like $38 trillion by 2049, which is like more than the world's economy. And this paper that they had used as the basis for their climate risk calculations was recently retracted. But the Network for Greening the Financial Institute Systems doesn't really want to stop using it. So I think that's undue influence, and most people are not aware of that. There's also a group called Covering Climate Now. This is an umbrella media group. There's 500 media outlets that are signatory to it. They have an audience of 2 billion people. And they do things like this. Kyle Pope, who's one of their key people, interviewed the director of Mad Max, who told him how to make climate fear compelling. That's not journalism. That's advocacy. So, and ultimately, Canada is not the climate laggard that people try to make us out to be. This was prepared by William Van Wijngaarden and William Happer. Van Wijngaarden is with York University. He studied billions of climate points in Canada, got quite a detailed assessment there. So, essentially, Alberta's responsible for 0.06 of a degree of warming in the past century. And there are consequences for the lack of climate debate because these policies are very costly and the climate hysteria is harming our children's mental health. So these 4 reports are on our blog. You can go by title and find them. But just to give you one quick point, 2020 to 2030 federal and provincial climate measures based on Carbon Policy Tracker are $476 billion, or $11,900 per resident of Canada, or $28,000 per household over 10 years. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole bunch more there. And what would the benefit be if we met all of our targets? Well, Canada might reduce warming by 0.07 of a degree Celsius by 2100 if we met all of our targets and everyone else in the world did. But in fact, you know, in probably a day or an hour, China would outpace whatever reductions we had. And beyond these costs and risks, there's also the risk of a personal carbon ration being imposed upon you. So Deadline 2020 was put together in 2016 by a group called ARUP for the C40 cities. In fact, in Canada, our carbon footprint is more like 14 to 17 tons CO2, depends on where you live. If you live up north, it's higher because you have to fly in all your food. But they want to get it to 0 by 2050, and in the middle of there, they want to go to 2.9 tons CO2. So just imagine what that would mean to you in terms of reduction in the energy use. I'm not just talking about driving your car, you know, heating your house. I mean, energy is everywhere and everything. the food you eat, the food you cook. We might all be, this is why they're going for crickets, you know? And food made in a biotech reactor. So the thesis is that if CO2 is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate, then none of these burdensome costs, regulations, or restrictions are necessary. And in order to be free from climate fear, we need to keep talking. And I would also like to thank everyone for listening to the presentation, and thanks for being here.